Hello, and thank you for joining me on this ramble around St Nicholas Churchyard. These online sessions are really all about trying to get us together in some sort of way to cope with the fact that we can't meet together in person. We are living during this time of COVID-19. It's a historic time, so it certainly makes sense to me to be able to make time to explore a little bit of our shared history. I'm very grateful for the encouragement that I've received from Enjoy Sutton and from Sutton Civic Society. I'm Jeff Richards, by the way, and I am one of the trustees of the Friends of St Nicholas Churchyard. Enjoy Sutton is the group of organisations that really look after our high street in terms of encouraging people to go there as a destination. It's about 500 different organisations are members of Enjoy Sutton. Absolutely first-class work that they're doing. And Sutton Civic Society, mostly known as the critical friend of the council when it comes to leading on planning work and thinking about how we can develop Sutton in a way that benefits us all and makes best use of these resources and the needs of development. So if you're interested in the future of Sutton, then I certainly recommend you join the Sutton Civic Society. And I'm going to be touching on some ideas as we go through here. Certainly I'm going to be touching on things like the growth of English empire, thinking about terms of the overseas origins of capitalism, the origins of trade, including the slave trade, a number of very important topics that affect us where we live now and when we live now. And if you do want to know more about that, then I thoroughly recommend that you speak to Sutton College and explore how their curriculum within the history and culture area can provide you with more information. So I'm very pleased to be working with Sutton College in promoting their courses. This is a monument that you will find on the floor of St Nicholas Church. It's this church, the stone is in the nave, it's on the south aisle, and it's close to the Lady Chapel. It's the monument to Henry Wyche, who was Rector of Sutton in the 17th century. He was Rector of Sutton for a very long time. And it reads, if we translate it, "To the Most Reverend Henry Wyche, a pious man, of proper learning and well born. He was the rector of the Church of Sutton. He died in the year of Christ, 1678, at the age of 75, on the Ides of September." Now, the Ides of September, the 15th of September, and here you can see an extract from the register, and it shows you just at the bottom, towards the bottom of the screen, Henry Wyche is recorded as dying on September the 15th. Now, if we step into really the context of Henry's life, this is a map of London as it could be seen in 1603, and this is a map of London by Rither. That's Ryther, Rither, and Henry was born on the 17th of October in 1603, and he was the son of a merchant called Richard Wyche and his wife Elizabeth. Henry's father, Richard, as I said, was a merchant, and Richard had been born in the city of London. Richard had been born not in the city of London. He'd been born in Davenham in Cheshire, but this family had strong links to the city of London, and actually he claimed an ancestor who had been Lord Mayor of London in the past as well. So the family, although they were merchants, they also had land in Cheshire, and The family was mostly known through the shipbuilding and trade, overseas trade. So in 1604, in 1600, 31st of December 1600, Richard Wyche had been instrumental in the setup of what was known as the East India Company. So he was on the first committee of the directors of what we know as the East India Company, and that's the governor and company of the merchants of London trading into the East Indies. And this East India Company, I mentioned it was started on 31st of December 1600, and that was in Queen Elizabeth's reign, and the company was formed for the exploitation of trade with the East and Southeast Asia, and they had actually the monopoly of rights of trade between England and the East. So anyone wanting to bring in goods from the East had to go through the East India Company. This period of right at the end of the 16th century and into the 17th century was a very dramatic period for the opening up of trade. And so there's major changes in the technology affecting ships. The designs of craft were changed to enable longer voyages. They actually carried, per tonnage, fewer crew. They were able to carry a greater weight of cargo. And there were improvements in navigation technology and cartography, which meant journeys gradually became more predictable. But economic changes actually made in the northern European countries in the late 16th century and into the 17th century meant that the centre of trade gradually shifted from the Mediterranean into the North Atlantic. So you think about companies like the East India Company, but there was also before then the Dutch East India Company. These were conglomerations, these were confederations of merchants coming together. Now the trade there was private affairs, it was private enterprise doing this, so that the merchants were organising these companies rather than the crown or the government. And so the merchants, in order to be able to afford the risk involved in trade, developed new concepts in finance. And the developments of the 17th century meant that we created things like joint stock companies, maritime insurance, contract and property law. There were all sorts of banking reforms that really laid the foundation of the modern capitalist system that we have today. And so Henry grew up in a family with very, very wide horizons. I mentioned that Henry's father was called Richard. His mother was called Elizabeth Saltonstall, and they had married around about 1583 or 84. And they were probably both around 28 or 29 years old when they got married. People, especially people with money at this time, didn't marry particularly early. So there, and I've touched on that, I think, in other presentations. Now, their home was in the City of London. It was actually in the parish of St Dunstan's in the east, within the City of London. And while Richard was busy building up his business, they together, Richard and Elizabeth, were also getting busy building their family. Together, Richard and Elizabeth had 18 children. And so Henry Wyche, the person of our interest, was the 15th child, born around 1603, as I said. He was born in 1603. Elizabeth, his mother, died in the January of 1627 when she was about 72 years old. So they were prosperous and they were blessed in terms of good lifespan as well. Now, Richard Wyche, Henry's father, was a freeman of Skinner's Company, which was, and he was actually a master of that at some point. Now, Skinner's is one of the oldest London livery companies, and that meant that he was very influential when it came to trade, and his business connections were very, very extensive. Now, Henry's father also assisted in the formation of a company that traded with North America, which was the Northwest Company in 1612, and he was one of the investors within the Adventurers of the Muscovy Company. So the Northwest Company traded furs with what is now Northwest or Western Canada, and the Muscovy Company had a monopoly of trade between England and Muscovy, Russia, until 1698. And here's a map actually of part of Muscovy, but what's not shown on here is actually quite a few places were named after Richard Wyche. So this is Henry's father. So there's Wyche's Islands, or Wyche's Land, which were discovered and named in 1617. They're now called Concar's Land, which is part of Spitsbergen, and there's also Wychbukta, which is on the east coast of Spitsbergen, Wychfjellet, also on Spitsbergen's east coast, and Wyche Sound, named and discovered in 1614, which is now called Liefdjefjorden and Woodfjorden. And so they're all named after Henry's father. So it's nice to know that you've got a sense of placing something on the map. Now, Henry himself was educated at Tunbridge School. Tunbridge School, that's in Kent, and it's owned by, and at that time it was owned by, the Worshipful Company of Skinners. The school received a series of generous endowments from one of the governors of the East India Company while Henry was at the school. There would have been about 85 boys in the school, and it was very much focused on the classical education for gentlemen. And Henry's father died in 1620 when Henry was just 17 years old. So he would have still just been at that point of heading off, leaving the school and heading off to university. And we know that Henry went to Emmanuel College, which is part of Cambridge University, and he went from Tunbridge as a Smythe exhibitioner. And that meant that he had been identified as somebody who was bright, somebody who, because he wasn't the eldest son, he was the 15th child within the Wyche family, wasn't necessarily going to get money from anywhere else. And so there was a monetary award to help him through his college days. And the money was very much designed with the expectation that the recipient would study divinity and would go into the church. And Emmanuel College was, at Cambridge, was a Puritan college. It was very much focused on the Reformed side of the church. This what I'm looking at here is Tunbridge School. I incidentally found while I was doing some Googling that there is a Reverend Henry Wyche Prize for Mathematics at Tunbridge School, but I suspect that is another Henry and that's another Wyche, but I'll have to find that out from the school. Between 1624 and 1636, there's a 12-year gap where I just don't know what happened to Henry. But I do know that what's going on in general at the beginning of the 17th century is pretty extraordinary in terms of rapid change. I mentioned how commerce was developing all through this period, but there were political and religious changes taking place too. here, this person that I've shown you here was James VI of Scotland, and James VI of Scotland inherited the English throne in 1603, and so he united all of those. He united both crowns under his person as James I. Now, at the beginning of the 17th century, Sutton, like lots of places around the country, would have been experiencing all sorts of religious tensions. Now, the Lord of the Manor, and this is a drawing from 100 years after Henry Wyche's time, so this is from around about the 1780s. But it gives you a sense of what the church was like. It's the old church building, well before any of the major alterations which saw the rebuilding of St. Nicholas Church in 1864. So this is the old church building, and we had a lord of the manor at the time who was Francis Carew. He lived in Beddington. We didn't really have at their time a main house at Sutton until later on, sort of part way through, about 1620s in Sutton. So there was nobody big, important living in Sutton. But the lord of the manor at the beginning of the century was Sir Francis Carew, and he wasn't the most enthusiastic Protestant, though he did his duty in administering this part of Surrey. He seemed to avoid getting into trouble simply by pottering around his garden in Beddington. Certainly not everyone, though, in the area liked the changes to the church. So you had, for example, a rector who, right at the beginning of the 17th century, so this is one of Henry's predecessors, called Robert Caudle. So he became rector of Sutton the year of Henry's birth, and he was a married man, but he had to take one of his parishioners to court to stop him singing dirty songs about his wife. And now I would like to sort of head down that particular rabbit hole and talk about people singing dirty songs in the 17th century, but I think I'm going to take a pause and get back to what we're writing about. Now, at the time of the 17th century, you had things like the writing of the King James Bible. That was finished and published in 1611. In the 1611, actually, the Manor of Sutton came into the possession of the Darcy family, who are relatives of the Carews. So Dame Grace Darcy appointed somebody to be rector in 1624. This was the immediate predecessor of Henry Wyche, and this was a man called Jos Glover. Now, there are certain parallels between the Glover family and the Wyche family. Jos Glover, and no matter what's on the red plaque outside the church, it is never Joseph Glover. It's wrong. It's either Jos or Jesse. You can get away with Jesse, but Jos or Jossa, because the name is and his Latin name, as it's recorded in the church records, is Jodicus, and the name in Breton and in Dutch is Jesse, and Jess or Joss is what it was known in English. And the Glover family, going back into this family, the Glover family were merchants, and they were focused on the West Indies trade and links with the Netherlands, and they had strong links with the Netherlands. I think they may well have been Puritan exiles during the reign of Elizabeth there. Britain's conquest in the West Indies had begun with the conquest of Bermuda in 1609, and then Barbados was taken in 1625. To give you a sense of the sort of ruthlessness of trade at the time, let's give you a map of the island of St. Kitts. So the focus on these first colonies, this is what the Glover family was investing in, was in tobacco production, with the switch to sugar taking place in 1640. So that's after our time, or after Jos Glover's time. But once the switch to sugar came, that's when slaves started to be introduced in greater numbers into the island. So one of the drivers to switch to sugar was the increasing competition from the colony of Virginia, and Virginia is certainly going to come up a little bit later on in the story of Sutton again. But if we first consider the first English colony of St. Kitts, and this is St. Kitts, that was established in 1623, and that was followed by a French colony in 1625. The English and the French would, despite their political differences, would do strange things in the colony. So, for example, they briefly united in order to carry out systematic massacres of the indigenous Kalinago people, and then they partitioned the island with them. So the English colonists were in the middle and the French were on either end. So very much it's a strong sense of ruthlessness as this was carried out. Now, the Jos family, Jos's family, that was the Glover family, had money then. So Jos Glover married a Sarah Ofield at some point before coming to St. Nicholas. Now, Sarah herself was from another wealthy family and brought with her a generous dowry. This is her monument in St. Nicholas. So Sarah died in 1624. So this is, they came to St. Nicholas in 1624. This is, Sarah died in 1628. Sarah died in 1628. The Ofield and the Glover families were Puritans. So Puritans were the faction within the church that very much believed in the sense of reformation and reformed doctrines of the church. They sought to purify the Church of England from its Catholic practices and maintained that the Church of England was only partially reformed. They wanted to see much greater changes to the way in which the church was governed and the way in which worship was carried out. Now, Sarah's brother was a man called Samuel Ofield. Now, he happened to be one of Oliver Cromwell's officers during the Civil War. This isn't Samuel Ofield here, but I'll come on to who this person is in a moment. Now, the Ofields had interests in Surrey, and Samuel Ofield, or Oldfield, was MP for Gatton near Reigate, so that's to the south of Sutton. Sarah's cousin, Catherine Ofield, was married to this man, Colonel George Fleetwood. And Colonel George Fleetwood was one of the regicides of King Charles I. Now, a regicide is one of the people who signed, and there were 59 regicides who signed King Charles I's death sentence in 1649. And between them, Sarah and Jos had 3 children. Roger, born at Sutton in the year that they came there, 1623, then Elizabeth and Sarah as well. So after Sarah died, then Jos Glover married, or Jos Glover married Elizabeth Harris. Elizabeth was the daughter of another minister, Reverend Nathaniel Harris, another Surrey minister. It's this sense that a minister who is unmarried would do his duty by marrying the widow of another minister. So that's a theme that will come out again. Now, together, Priscilla and they had 2 children, Priscilla and John. And I'm going to jump ahead because there's a lot to talk. I could be talking about the Glover family when I want to talk about the Wyche family. So I'm going to cover the Glovers, but the point is that Jos Glover was a member of the Massachusetts Bay Company in New England, and that's important because he had a way out. It was where Puritans could go; they could just disappear, and basically, what happened is that he did just disappear one day, and that's a simplification. Now, this document that I'm showing up here is the Declaration of Sports. It was originally issued by James I in 1618, but it was reissued by Charles I in the October of 1633 as the King's Majesty's declaration to his subjects concerning lawful sports to be used. Now, the book basically said it was okay to engage in pleasurable recreation on a Sunday afternoon after services have been carried out. And it was thought that the new declaration was written by Charles's new Archbishop of Canterbury called William Laud, and Charles ordered that any minister who refused to read it would be deprived of their position, their living within the church. Now, the Lord of the Manor then, Edward Darcy, wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury on the 12th of December 1634 and declared that Jos Glover had refused to publish the Book of Sports, and that he, Edward Darcy, in his desire to have due obedience given to the royal command of his sacred majesty, caused the same book to be published in the said church by a neighbouring minister. So basically what had happened is that Glover had done a bunk. He had skipped away to Massachusetts, and so he exits really our story at this point. There's so much to say about the Glover family that I will come back to it another day. But his departure left a vacuum in Sutton that had to be filled. It had to be filled, and eventually that was done in 1636. Now, the Register of St. Nicholas Church, and you can see an extract from the Register, wrote a very careful inscription. Henry Wyche, being non-regent Master of Arts in the University of Cambridge, was inducted by Thomas Pope into the Rectory of Sutton, 10th of June, in the year of our Lord, 1636. After a resignation made of the same rectory by Jos Glover, who was much beloved of the most, if not all, and his departure much lamented of the most, if not all. So Henry was 33. This is our Henry Wyche, when he came to Sutton. He was, as far as we know, unmarried. He was certainly educated when he arrived. He was, as it said here, non-regent Master of Arts. And if his inscription is a judge, he was not without diplomatic wit and the ability to turn a careful phrase. Now, he came to Sutton and his worldview was vast. His older brother, Peter, had just been appointed the English ambassador to the Ottoman court in Istanbul. His younger brother, Nathaniel, had been sent to India to look after the family's interests within the East India Company. And so it's a very strange world in which he's joined. Now, if I step on just a few years, in 1639, that was when the first of the wars started that would traumatise the country. The King Charles I, following the advice of the Archbishop of Canterbury, had tried to enforce uniformity of worship and the rule of bishops on the Scottish Church. In Scotland, dismay and discontent erupted into a rebellion in what became known as the Bishops' War. The war with Scotland was expensive, and the king called Parliament to raise money to cover his military expenses, only to have Archbishop basically not go the way he wanted. Parliament turned round and imprisoned Laud, and another advisor, Lord Strafford, was executed in 1641. And in 1641 there was a revolt in Ireland that would create a de facto rebellion, or de facto government as a result of the rebellion, for most of Ireland in 1649, when it was finally crushed by Oliver Cromwell. Now, our family that we're interested in, the Wyche family, they were royalist. And in 1641, Henry's brother, Peter Wyche, became Privy Councillor and Controller of the King's household. He was a signer of the King's declaration of abhorrence at the idea of making war upon his Parliament. Now, it was his descendant, Cyril Wyche, that reported that Peter lent Charles I £30,000, and that's a huge amount of money, just a huge amount of money, and the politics of the period just descended almost inevitably into war. You had decisions which might have made sense at the time, but looking back at them were awful. So here's King Charles trying unsuccessfully to arrest 5 members of the House of Commons that he considered problematic in 1642. But that invasion of the House of Commons sets in train a series of events that really set Parliament against the King, and then the King rose his standard in 1642, and so the English Civil War began. And fighting did come close to Sutton. So you've got a map here from the early 17th century. This is Speed's map, and in 1642, for example, a labourer was hedging one Saturday night in the grounds of Nonsuch Palace, and you can see Nonsuch is enclosed. If you see where we've got Sutton on the map, right in the centre of the map, just to the left you see, to the south left, sort of the southwest of Sutton on the map you see Cheam, and to the west of that you see an enclosed park. That is Nonsuch, the grounds of Nonsuch Palace, and that was a magnificent palace in Cheam, the neighbouring, one of the royal palaces. It was the neighbouring village to the west of Sutton. The palace is now lost. But anyway, a labourer working there had seen 200 horsemen arrive at one of the houses within the grounds, and he noticed them staying overnight, and he hurried off to Kingston. You can see Kingston is on the river, and that was where a parliamentary garrison was, but it was too late. Actually, the soldiers followed after him and entered the town and actually occupied the town. In actual bloodshed comes very close to Sutton, and Cheam is really only a mile and a half away from Sutton. So you've got a register in 1643 which records 3 deaths. A soldier who came sick into town was buried on the June 19th, 1643. Another soldier called James Brunwell was buried June the 26th in 1643. And a soldier called Mates the Polonian was buried on October the 12th, 1643. Now that Mates the Polonian is a reminder that the war brought mercenary soldiers into the kingdom. In the early years of the war, Parliament lost popular support through their habit of employing brutal foreign mercenaries and soldiers of fortune, and there was a heavy set amount of resentment against the high levels of pillage, looting, and frankly rape by foreign mercenaries. The worst offenders were actually probably the Germanic and Bohemian soldiers who were employed to fight for Parliament. And now this illustration here is of a mercenary captain for the parliamentary forces, and he's wearing a Polish-style Zishaga helmet with a fluted skull, sliding nasal bar and a small tube to the front on the left, in which the plume would be attached. And this actually comes from an article talking about the ethnicity of soldiers of the English Civil War, and in another book by called Soldiers and Strangers, An Ethnic History of the English Civil War by Mark Stoyle of the University of Southampton, this contains a quote from one mercenary captain: "I care not for your cause. I fight for your half-crown and your handsome women." And that role of the vulnerability of women is underscored by this registry entry from 1644. In 1644, Henry Wyche married Ellen Quinnell, or Quinnell. And so they'd married on the 15th of October, 1644. Ellen Quinnell was the widow of Robert Quinnell, the vicar of Ashted. Robert Quinnell had died on the 16th of September 1643, and so at that point Ellen would strictly have been made homeless, as she would have lost the right to live at the vicarage in Ashted when the new man arrived. And so we cannot be certain that Henry's offer of marriage was not just an offer to protect a widow. Admittedly, Ellen was a young widow, but you'll remember that I mentioned that William Stevens had also, Jos Glover had also married a widow. So it was seen very much from the Puritan Reformed Church mindset, if you're going to shelter the widow by taking them into your household. Now, it's worth taking a detour away from Sutton to talk a little bit about where Ellen came from, which was Ashted. You can see Ashted on the map. It's down right at the bottom of the screen, underneath where it says Weybridge 100. So it's at the bottom left. It's about 7 or 8 miles away from Sutton to the north, to the southwest. The new vicar of Ashted was a man called William King. He had been vicar of Cobham and was appointed to Ashted before the end of 1643. So he came, and Ellen would have had to have moved, and she probably sought refuge with Henry Wyche at that point. Now, he was a supporter of Parliament and a Presbyterian. He had no love for bishops, and he was destined actually to be deprived of the living of Ashted following the Restoration in 1660. One of the reasons that William King was so keen to leave Cobham was probably because of a group of people who became known as the Diggers. Now, the Diggers were a group of Protestant radicals within the south of England, and they're sometimes seen as the we project onto them all sorts of ideas of socialism or anarcho-syndicalism, agrarian socialism, and even you get words like Georgism, which is to do with the importance of farming within the centrality of a community life. So they had a leader, certainly in Cobham, called Gerard Winstanley. They were originally known as the True Levellers, and later became known as the group started to get a little bit more sort of radical, known as the Diggers, because of their attempts to force themselves to farm together on common land. And it's hard to think of it. It's really hard to project ourselves into the past. This is a world in which religious faith is both so central and so divisive. Nearly everyone knew and accepted that God existed, But just as the Presbyterians would rip up the Anglican prayer book and the structure of the established church, and as they attempted to reform it anew in their own image, they'd actually not anticipated that people may not accept that they have the authority to do that, but they may also have given people the idea that they themselves could recreate the church and the worship of God in their own image as well. And as I said, this example took place in Cobham. This is just 11 miles away from Sutton. Now, 11 miles, to give you a sense, if you think, and we know because I've talked in previous rambles, that London is just on the horizon. There were boys from Sutton being apprenticed to London, and people would use Sutton where they chose to live, but their trade and business would be in London. That's 12 miles away. Cobham is 11 miles away from Sutton. And so from where King left in 1650, from when King left in 1633, not 1640, 1643, to when a new person was appointed in 1653, there was no vicar in Cobham, and the people really just had to make up religion on their own. And there was no vicar in Cobham, and the people just went completely bonkers, really, in terms of where they went. There was no routing, there was no discipline, there was no rhythm of normal life. So Winstanley, the leader of the diggers in Cobham, had become a Baptist in 1643. He had gone through the ordinance of dipping. And in 1649, he became very close to John Fielder, the leader of an independent church or conventicle. The word conventicle is used very often for independent churches in Kingston. In Kingston, you know where Kingston is on the map. Fielder would eventually become one of the early Quakers, and then the Presbyterians would persecute those conventicles, the independents, and the Quakers themselves. I mentioned that the Presbyterians ripped up the prayer book, and Parliament did rip up the prayer book. Here you can see the outlawing of the Book of Common Prayer. So the Book of Common Prayer was outlawed in 1645 to be replaced by the Directory of Public Worship, which was not really a prayer book, but more a set of instructions. How widely anyone used the directory is not certain. So it's likely that the prayer book was used clandestinely by just about everyone, not least because the new directory made no provision for many different pastoral services, especially funerals, for example. You didn't have a burial service within the directory, and in years like in 1645, which was a plague year, that became important. Certainly in Cheam, it became important. And following the execution of Charles I in 1649 and the establishment of the Commonwealth, this is not going to be, nothing is going to come back until 1660, after the restoration of the monarchy into England. Now, the clergy in this part of Surrey would have had a shared sort of outlook in life. I mean, it's likely that the parish priests of Cheam, Sutton and Carshalton all shared not only a similar sense of politics, but also a similar sense of churchmanship. Henry Wyche was probably more reform-minded than, say, the vicar of Cheam and the vicar of Carshalton, but let's give you an example of the type of harassment that they endured. Now, this is a story from Cheam, and this is from the rector of Cheam at the time of the Civil War. It was a man called John Hackett. John Hackett was known to be a royalist. Remember, Wyche is a royalist, but he's come from a Reformed church environment. The Hackett family was serve God and be cheerful. And he would need to remember, John Hackett would need to remember to serve God and be cheerful. And he was taken prisoner when the Earl of Essex came through with a force, made his way through Cheam. And legend has it, and that is recorded in one of the books of history, Marshall's book of Cheam and Sutton, that poor John Hackett was found hiding in the cellars of Whitehall. Whitehall is the house in Cheam that you probably know. It's one of the heritage properties of Sutton. But on his release, he refused the Surrey committees. This is the organising committee provided by Parliament. They tried to make him change the way in which he conducted services. He resisted that. Nothing could change his Anglican convictions, and he went back to using the Book of Common Prayer for all of his services. It's said that once, during a service, a soldier pointed a pistol, came into church, interrupted the service while he was conducting morning prayer, and pointed a pistol at him because he was using an illegal service. But Hackett turned to the soldier, and said that he would do what became a divine, and a soldier would have to do what became a soldier. Now, the soldier retired discomfited, and John Hackett continued his service. But you see the sense of tension that men like Henry Wyche had to face, the harassment in the way in which they conducted their service to God and to their people. Now, really bloody fighting did come close to Sutton, and that was in 1648. There was a plot by royalists to assemble under the cover of one of the frequent race meetings that took place at Bansard Downs. So I'm well aware that people from look at this these videos not just from Sutton but from wider areas, and you may not know some of the history. You see that there's a town to the south of Cheam and Sutton called Bansard, and Epsom is also shown over to shown on the map as well. Epsom and Bansard were the locations for horse racing, and actually would start all the way through these hills, which are marked on here, where people would ride from Carshalton, an area called Barrow Hedges, all the way through to Epsom. Long horse racing up on the high ground. And there was this plot to assemble people. This is because Charles I was in captivity on the island of Wight, and it was part of a general systematised summer series of risings to try and lever Parliament, to distress Parliament, to force the release of Charles I. At the beginning of the month of July 1648, Earl Holland, the Duke of Buckingham, Lord Francis Villiers, the Earl of Peterborough, and several others gathered around 700 horsemen with supporting foot soldiers and started at Kingston, and they were heading off to Reigate. That's further south and not shown on the map. And they were engaged by Colonel Rich with his regiment of horse. These were parliamentary soldiers who opposed them, and they intercepted them on the boundary of the Nonsuch estate, just on the other side of to the west boundary of the park. The fighting is being described as very fierce, with over 100 prisoners being taken by the parliamentary forces. Lord Villiers, this man, one of the men, is called out as fighting with great courage and being offered quarter by Colonel Rich, but declining and choosing to fight to the death. And 6 of the dead from that combat are buried in Cheam Churchyard. And we can get a sense of the churchmanship of the local ministers who, in this furore, this period of disturbance, by looking at something that the Vicar of Carshalton chose to have. You can see you've got Cheam, Sutton, Carshalton marked on here. The Vicar of Carshalton at the time was a man called William Quelch, and he had been vicar for 30 years when he died in 1654, so that's before the Restoration. And on his memorial in church, he describes how it was his lot, through God's mercy, to burn incense here. Now that may well have been a figurative expression, but certainly not a Puritan, I think. Now what you can also write can be very dangerous. The register at Carshalton, and I mentioned William Quelch before, accurately kept period. All the register was kept very neatly up to date, except for the period between 1644 and 1651, where there is just a gap, and the records are then inserted after 1651. So there may well have been a change in the regime. Now, in the case of Sutton, Ellen Wyche, Henry's widow, when he died, carried away the register from Sutton after his death in 1678, and they were not returned to Sutton until after 1690. So that Sutton actually didn't have a register for a while, and the clerks had to find another way of keeping things in. But people were paranoid about the way in which any records in the church could be used against them as part of the persecution of the church. But the registers of Sutton do contain the details of how Henry and Ellen's family grew. So you have from 1645 Helena Wyche being born, 1648 Henry Wyche shown here being born, 1651 James Wyche, 1652 Susan Wyche, 55 Elizabeth Wyche, and 1657 William Wyche. So more and more of these children being born. And by 1660, the war had meant that England and the other home nations, Wales and Scotland and Ireland, had been through a terrible time. All sorts of disturbances, and Henry had experienced the anxiety of persecution and religious turmoil, yet he and all those neighbouring priests, Quelch in Carshalton and John Hackett in Cheam, had been able to provide a great deal of stability to this part of Surrey. But after all the years of the Commonwealth, all the Republican experiment that had taken place, many of the governing classes and the military officers were heartily sick of the experiment. And Charles II was invited to return, and the monarchy was restored in 1660. And by now, when that took place in 1660, Henry Wyche was 57, and he continued to serve in Sutton. So he'd gone through a horrendous period of knowing the King James I, Charles I, going through the years of Republican and Commonwealth government and the Protectorate through to the Restoration. The Wyche family was well positioned to thrive now with the Restoration, and his brother Peter's daughter Jane had married actually a man called John Granville in 1652. This is before the Restoration. Now, John Granville was the first Earl of Bath, and a royalist soldier and statesman, and during the Civil War had played a major role in the Restoration. So Henry's niece was married to the man who was one of the negotiators with Monk to bring back, Monk is the general, the Republican general who brought back the monarchy. And he was later appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland for that service. What's interesting about Granville and what it means for the Wyche family is that Granville was a signatory to the several declarations of the Company of Royal Adventurers of England trading into Africa. This document was published in 1667 by the Royal African Company, a corporation that attempted to monopolise the slave trade in England, and that started really through the 1660s. This is probably evidence that Granville, this is Henry Wyche's niece's husband, consciously supported and funded England's slave industry. So the Royal African Company was led by the Duke of York, James, who would become James II of England, and he was Charles II's brother. Granville's close relationship with Charles II, it's likely that because he had a close relationship with Charles II, he was told to invest in the Royal African Company. And Jane Granville, this niece of Henry Wyche, was Lady of the Bedchamber to Catherine of Braganza, the Queen Consort of England. So this is Henry is tied in through his cousins, through his nieces and nephews, to very powerful voices in the development of trade, in the development of commerce involving slavery. And still, Henry's family grew. In 1661, Anne Wyche was born. 1663, Rebecca Wyche was born. 71, he started to see his family themselves get married. So his daughter, 1671, married a guy called Cuthbert Dale, and they stay in the register for a while. But I want to turn to, I've mentioned slavery now, so I'm going to mention something else. A notable baptism took place on Easter Day, on the 18th of April 1677, and this is described in the parish register as that of John Sango, a Moor. Now, we don't know when John Sango came to Sutton, but he is likely to have been transported by the Royal African Company. By the year he was baptised, which is 1677, the company was starting to incur a lot of losses, actually caused by competition with the Dutch and the different Anglo-Dutch wars that were being fought for this trade. And the RAC, the Royal African Company, traded slaves mostly along the west coast of Africa, and in the years running up to 1677 they were active in establishing forts and trading posts in the area that we call today Ghana. So the name Sango is possibly Yoruba in origin, and if it's correct that Sango is a Yoruba name, then it's referring to the god of thunder and lightning. Now, John Sango unfortunately does not appear again in the registers of Sutton, and we lose sight of him. So Sango is not a common name, but it does appear in the records of London parishes later in the century and into the 18th century. So it looks like John, or perhaps another male Sango, got married and had children. But the Africanness of John Sango, and and many other Sangos that appear in the registers of churches have probably been lost because of confusion with other groups. Now, in 1685, some 50,000 French Huguenot refugees who were fleeing religious persecution arrived in England. And as you can see here, people assume that names may well be of French origin rather than African origin. So they're inventing this because it's Sangay, it should be Sango, but it's not. It's Sango. It's an African name. And if we go back to Sutton, to Henry Wyche and his family, it was around the time that John Sango was baptised that Henry Wyche made his will, and he died. He was meant to die in September 1678, but he made his will 2 days after he had baptised John Sango. So, in the name of God, Amen. I, Henry Wyche, Rector of Sutton in Surrey County, being in perfect health and memory, praised be God, do make and ordain this my last will and testament. First, I bequeath my soul to God my Maker, hoping through the meritorious death and passion of my only Saviour, Jesus Christ, to receive the free pardon and forgiveness of all my sins, and to enjoy everlasting life with my Saviour, and as for my body, to be buried in a Christian burial at the discretion of my wife. I bequeath and give all my personal goods to Ellen, my wife, to be disposed of as she pleases among my children, and I make her my sole executrix. Lastly, I give unto the poor of Sutton 40 shillings. This I make my last will and testament, revoking all other wills and testaments whatsoever. In witness hereto I set my hand and seal the day and date above, Henry Wyche. After his death, his wife, Ellen, headed to Lincolnshire with a son called Richard, who actually isn't mentioned in our registers. But Henry's son, also called Henry, was 35 at the time of his father's death. And we know that he emigrated to Virginia. Virginia was very much a royalist colony. And just on another note, it was the Royal African Company and its successors that had the monopoly to transport slaves to Virginia. It's not outside the bounds of possibility that John Sango was the property of one of the Wyche family. But we do know that Henry Wyche, the son, settled in Surrey County on the Nottoway River. And he first appears in Virginia records in September of 1679. He did get married. We don't know the name of his wife, but he died prior to March 1874. He was the father of 4 sons, George, Henry, William and James, and he owned 3 slaves. But all that takes the history away from Sutton. And so we come back to the monument of Henry Wyche. How can I sum up Henry Wyche? Henry Wyche was a child of a rich and prosperous family. That family helped to develop the money and trade system that we use today. And that also included the trade in other human beings. He and his family provided a stable centre to Sutton when all about society in the 17th century was being torn apart by civil war. He adapted and did his duty. He would have looked out at parishioners, many of whom were in opposing sides in a bloody civil war, and he kept the peace. He used the same words of baptism for John Sango as he would for any of his flock. and he admitted them into the same family of Christ that he had baptized his own children. Yet his family, including his son, traded in the lives of others. Perhaps we should include the words here that Henry would have spoken every morning and evening as he said morning and evening prayer. Dearly beloved brethren, the Scripture moveth us in sundry places to acknowledge and confess our manifold sins and wickedness, that we should not dissemble nor cloak them before the face of Almighty God our Heavenly Father, but confess them with a humble, lowly, penitent and obedient heart, to the end that we may obtain forgiveness of the same by his infinite goodness and mercy. It will be a deeper wisdom than mine to conclude whether or not this epitaph is true. The Most Reverend Henry Wyche, a pious man of proper learning and well born. He was the rector of the Church of Sutton. He died in the year of Christ 1678 at the age of 75 on the Ides of September. I've intended to inform, to educate, and hopefully entertain you. But I think here I've come to the end of my ramble. Please do subscribe to the YouTube channel, as all the rambles that I've engaged in are listed here. I hope you have enjoyed learning a little bit about the history of Sutton. If you want to know more about local and national history and to develop some of the ideas that we've explored here, then please do look at the classes run by Sutton College. We've worked on the college on a lot of projects. Do comment on what you want me to cover in future rambles. And next week's ramble is going to be about Alice Stewart and her life and times. Alice was one of the women that we featured in our 2018 exhibition called Extraordinary Women. But for now, I'm going to say goodbye. So long, Sutton, your history.